Hi, in this film I'm going to introduce the thinking of Augustine on human nature. And there is a fundamental issue that lies behind this part of the course on religious thought, and that is the question, are human beings basically good or are they basically evil? And I want to illustrate this as we start thinking about Augustine by relating it to politics and to theology. In 1982, Margaret Thatcher stood up in front of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland and she took the classic Hobbesian line, Thomas Hobbes, describing human nature and human life as nasty, brutish and short, and human nature as basically self-interested. And she explained that the conservative view differs fundamentally from the socialist view because to the conservative, human beings are basically evil, and that's why we need to conserve the traditions and the laws that have established stability. Whereas to the socialist, human beings are basically good and their lives can be seriously improved by eliminating poverty, improving education, and so on. Now, for Augustine, he was influenced by a number of things. First of all, by the Manichees, who had a dualist view of human nature, that there was a good spirit, if you like, God, and there was an evil spirit, the devil, and that human beings were subject to the influences of both, and we call that dualism. Although Augustine supposedly rejected Manichaeism later on when he converted to Christianity, it could be argued, when we evaluate Augustine in a separate film, that he retains something of that dualist emphasis. For Augustine, though, evil is the privation of good, so it doesn't exist as an entity in itself, influenced by the Neoplatonists. His argument is that evil is really an absence of good, or an absence of the grace of God, if you like, operating in our life to elevate us to a higher status of goodness. So, Augustine argues that evil originates from the fall, and before human beings fell, taking the examples of the fall in Genesis, chapters 2 and 3, human beings existed in perfect harmony with each other. So friendship between Adam and Eve was the defining state, what we call concordia in Latin. And that included sexual relations. So according to Augustine, Adam and Eve were married and they lived in this state of bliss, of perfect harmony. Secondly, they were both perfectly obedient to God, even though God warns them about taking the decision to eat the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Actually, it's just described as a fruit, but traditionally painted as an apple. And thirdly, there was no lust. There was no unbridled passion in the Garden of Eden. And what happens in the fall, therefore, is that human beings, Adam, led by Eve, choose to disobey God. They take a conscious choice. And they are beguiled, according to Augustine, by the serpent, who is actually the devil in a different form, who seduces them away from the perfect state of bliss. And the will is therefore corrupted by the fall. Because in the Garden of Evil, the two ideas, caritas, which is selfless love, is in perfect harmony also with cupiditas, the Latin word for selfish love, or love that is, as it were, serving self-interest alone. But after the fall, cupiditas and caritas become in tension with each other. So self-love and selfish love begin to act in tension with each other and in a sense can act in opposition to each other. And this is well illustrated by Romans chapter 7. If we read that chapter in Paul in his letter to the Romans carefully, what we find is a tension. So Paul states that we do not do the thing that we want, but the very thing that we do not want is what we do. And he goes on to say, who can deliver us from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord, because God has provided us with the way out through grace and through the activity and the acts of Jesus Christ and the power of the cross. We can be liberated from this state of fallenness, but we're going to need some help to escape it. So this leads us through Augustine's argument is that we now experience weakness of will. The Latin word for this is acrasia. And the sin of pride that has entered in a big way through the fall weakens the will and causes us to veer towards that selfish love or cupiditas and away from selfless love, which is caritas. There is a kind of civil war that is happening within the human spirit. And you could say this is true to our own experience, where we feel that we know what is right, echoing Paul, but we're often led away by our selfish desires to do something that we know is fundamentally wrong. And according to Augustine, we're now in a state where the body finds itself craving things like money, power, and indeed sexual lust. So we're led astray by human desires, the desires, if you like, of the flesh, as Paul describes it. And it is difficult for us, but not impossible, to find a way out of this. Moreover, Augustine argues that sin is now transmitted through sexual activity, so that all human beings are tainted by the sin of the fall, which orientates us towards cupiditas and away from caritas. And we are therefore subject to God's judgment, which Augustine describes as the second death, the day of judgment, when we will be convicted in the court of judgment unless we are redeemed and brought back from that slavery to sin by Jesus Christ and the cross.